I want you all to know that I'm not going to be able to talk about all of Archbold today because you'd have to have me for the entire Zahner lecture series. So I'm going to focus on one part of what we're doing, and that's the work on our working cattle ranch. I do have some brochures and leaflets out there if you're interested in the bigger picture, but bear with me. I'm hoping to use our work on this working ranch as illustrative or a little sort of insight into the big picture of what Archbold does. I'd particularly like to welcome, the scientists in the room, the educators in the room, the supporters in the room, the conservationists in the room. I love that confluence, and that's the confluence we have at Archbold, and it's so nice to feel that welcoming confluence here, so thank you. So Archbold's been around for 80 years, so we're a very long-established organization. The ranch we've had since 1989, so it's a relatively recent enterprise, but long-term nonetheless, over 30 years. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about that we're facing challenging times. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big Archbold, and then we're going to focus in on Buck Island Ranch. I'm going to show you a brief film called Cowboys and Scientists to spirit you off to a cattle ranch in Central Florida. And it's really remarkable for me to be looking out in this audience and see here too, there are fellow cattle ranchers in this audience, which really makes my heart feel good. So thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about Archbold's big strategic priorities and how we do those at the ranch. And I'm going to talk about what is very, very important for Archbold, and it's how do we take our science and translate that into actual conservation action. So that's, at the end of the day, we want our science to be making conservation differences where we work and beyond. Oh, actually, that was important. And I only had time, I can't be here all week, I only had time to give you 3 little examples. I'm going to talk about plants on the ranch, I'm going to talk about phosphorus on the ranch, everybody's favorite, and I'm going to talk about predators on the ranch, just to give you a little insight on what we do. Challenging times. Some of you maybe, are members of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and you might have seen this really depressing study they came out with this year. Nearly 3 billion birds lost across North America on an annual basis since 1970. And one that's very important for us in Central Florida and for Archbold and for working ranches is a 53% decline in grassland birds, one of the most threatened. So ranchers and working farms are really important for those grassland birds. And then I could go on and on. I don't want to get you into paroxysms of despair, obviously. But, this is a map of phosphorus around the world in croplands. The bright red is where there's too much phosphorus, and the light blues is where there's not enough phosphorus for crop production. It doesn't take a world geographer to see we have many areas of the world with too much phosphorus in the soils because of addition for fertilizer that's causing downstream problems. So we are facing challenging times, but our job is to look for solutions. Archbold, I am not going to be able to tell you the wonderful history of this organization, although you can talk to me afterwards over a glass of wine. We were founded in 1941 by the famous aviator explorer, Richard Archbold. We're an independent nonprofit, so we're not part of any other organization. We have about 50 staff plus our interns and volunteers, so it's a big organization. And we manage 20,000 acres, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we do the 3 big things, the confluence of science, conservation, and education. We teach what we learn from our science. Our science informs conservation. Have I just disappeared? Our conservation tells us what we need to do our science from. So that interplay between those 3 things is very important. Where do we work? I like the introduction. We have a beautiful, pristine, world-famous Florida scrub preserve that people from around the world, this is one of the highest biodiversity hotspots in North America, rare plants and animals associated with these acid, sandy soils. We have a full-scale working cattle ranch, which I'm going to talk about today. We're in the top 20 ranches in Florida. We're in the top 400 in the country in terms of number of cow-calf producers, so a big ranch. And we also have a large-scale restoration site, which I'm, again, not going to talk about today. So we work on pristine natural lands, we work on working lands, and we work on restoration, doing those same things, science, conservation, and education. And the wonderful thing about owning big acreages your land management becomes an extraordinary experiment for you. You are able to manipulate fire management. You're able to manipulate grazing. You're able to manipulate water. So these are natural laboratories where how we manage the land is an experiment in itself. Where do we work? Yes, we have the two properties. So those of you who know Florida, we're in the middle of Florida here. If you're wondering why I'm not using the pointer, somehow this screen doesn't like it. So we're in the middle of Florida, in the headwaters of the Everglades, the lands and waters that flow south to Okeechobee and then on to coastal estuaries, east, west, and south. That's a 2.67 million acre watershed. We like to say it goes from ridge to ranch to river, because on the west side of that watershed is this ancient sandy ridge that Archbold Biological Station, those dry sandy soils, very high biodiversity, wonderful fire-driven system. The green areas are all the conservation lands in that 2.67 million acres, more, and it's nearly 30% of the area. And when I say conservation lands, that includes things like a big Avon Park DOD bombing range. So it's lands that have conservation management as part of them. Here's Archbold Station here on the ridge, the reserve, which is the area we do the restoration, and this is Buck Island Ranch. And Buck Island Ranch is in the General Brown area, which is working farms and ranches. One of the biggest, people are always surprised. They drive through Florida, they come to Archbold to say, I didn't see anything on the way here. You think, you're doing the lead, looking out the window. You just pass hundreds of cows and cattle ranches and amazing ecosystems, whatever. So this is, looking at conservation involves understanding working farms. The little red dashes is everywhere where Archbold has recent ongoing research projects. I do need to brush it up because we have a few more sites, but it gives you the big picture. We work throughout that watershed, and our science helps inform conservation for the whole watershed. Our mission is to build and share knowledge, that's science and education, to protect the lifelands and waters. That's our conservation mission. We focus on the heart of Florida, but we want to leverage what we learn here into other ecosystems. We don't want to work in all those other places. We want them to learn from us. So, why would you work on, people are always like, why does Archbold have a ranch? So, cows are terrible. We won't have that discussion. So why do we have a ranch? Well, 20 to 30% of tropical and subtropical regions are grazing lands. That's a huge proportion of grazing lands in the world. There are 11 million hectares of these subtropical grazing lands in the US. It's not all temperate Western classic cowboy stuff. Of course, classic cowboys are from Florida. 1/5 of Florida is working ranchlands. That's a huge acreage. If we're going to solve conservation problems with challenges in Florida, subtropical ranches are this incredible mosaic. They're not feedlots. They are mixtures of pasture and open range and natural habitat. They're driven by the same things. They are the big things that drive Florida: fire, flood, and drought. Drive those ecosystems. Understanding that helps us understand those big drivers. And obviously now large herbivores are cows, not herds of megafauna from pre-10,000 years ago. This is what Archbold Biological Station, the main center, looks like. It's actually physically located at the station, but all of our research goes on the ranch. What we do, I say 8 big things. We do biodiversity and ecosystem function. What do I mean by ecosystem function? The big things that got biodiversity and we rely on. How does carbon cycle? How do nutrients like phosphorus cycle? How does water cycle? How does fire drive these systems? So those are the ecosystem functions, or the processes that we have to understand about how biodiversity is working. We're always looking for solutions. So although we do a lot of fundamental research, we're looking for solutions to invasive species and emerging diseases. We have entire research programs on these. We're looking to how to better manage land, whether it's grazing lands or shrub lands. We're looking at the impacts of habitat loss and land use change and land intensification. And of course, we're addressing climate change. If you want that lecture, that is a whole other lecture. How do we engage? We provide, like you, lots of learning opportunities. We provide K through 12, research, informal ed, things like this. Although your lecture series is really very impressive. I should take a leaf out of your book on that one. A big impact on conservation. And then how, as I said before, do we scale from what we learn at Archbold to the national to the international stage? How do we take what we're learning there and scale it up? We can't work everywhere. How do we share what we're learning here and have a bigger amplified impact? So if you look at Archbold, we have all the normal things, operations. We have cooks and cowboys. We have fundraising, that's important. Yeah, we do have cooks and cowboys. And then really, we have these big centers to impact our conservation action. All the science, the conservation science, all of our data now is relevant for conservation. The big data and technology, we have a team of 4 people doing full-time data management and those computer maps, GIS mapping. Stewardship, managing our own lands, agricultural and natural, and then the education, strategic communications and outreach, all looking to how we can create impact in conservation. And I'm going to take a little break and ask you if you can switch to the video. So I'll introduce this video while we're doing it. This is a video that was produced 2 years ago. We are continuing to fundraise to help pay for the mortgage on the ranch. So this was our fundraising video. So if you want to talk to me about that, I'll be very happy to have that conversation. Okay, off we go. Well, thank you. This also gives me an opportunity to thank most of what I'm going to say. I owe a tremendous amount to Jean Lawless, our ranch manager, who's just stepped down as president of the Florida Cattlemen's Association, and also to Betsy Boughton, who heads up our research agroecology program. She pulls together researchers from around the country. But she's really quite extraordinary, and we're very, very fortunate to have her. She is a leading researcher. Okay, when you're... Back to you. Yeah, I know. So I'm going to... You're good. We're all good. It's better than me doing it. We're going to concentrate now on the 3 examples I talked about, plants, phosphorus, and predators, and I'll try and rattle through them. There's quite a lot of science, so we're going to go on a quick joyride, and I'll do my best. So first of all, let's talk about plants and give credit to Betsy. We're going to talk about, remember the big things we work on, biodiversity, solutions, how do we look? I'm particularly going to focus on fire and grazing in plant diversity in wetlands. How do we engage with national networks to leverage this information? And then what are the conservation implications of this? So rather surprisingly, Buck Island Ranch is a typical working cattle ranch. This is some kind of nature preserve. To date, we've recorded 450 plant species, of which nearly 400 are native. That's an extraordinary number on an everyday working cattle ranch. It's something like 35% of the central Florida vascular flora. I seem to have lost it. Hello? I can't hear you. I'll just move that up a little bit. Hello? I'll keep talking and I'll shout. So very diverse, but this is typical of that whole region. Imagine multiplying that up from the 10,000 acres we have to the couple of, the hundreds of thousands of acres plus in the whole region. We'll not talk about this is bird diversity, other species. I haven't put bug diversity, but this place is diverse. A lot of that is documented. We have got 4,500 pressed plants in our herbarium. You too have a herbarium. They're all online. You can go and check them out. We're so proud they're on this network. So you can go and, if you're interested in a typical wetland plant, this is bloodroot or redroot, Lachnanthes caroliniana. I don't know if it comes up here. But it's a plant that's an ecosystem engineer, responds to all sorts of disturbance in wetlands. But this is we have very good herbarium records, and they're all online. So that we're really trying to document our biodiversity. And, this is the sort of species you see that sounds good. This is the sort of species you see when you wander into a Florida cattle ranch wetland. These are small seasonal wetlands, so high diversity. Some of them are in improved pastures. Those are highly modified, improved pastures. Some wetlands are in natural areas like this here. And this is, you can see the difference between the two. Pastures that have been highly modified for grass production, pastures that are largely what we call semi-native, they're largely native. So high plant diversity. Betsy's run an experiment for the past 15 years. She's been there for 10 years, where we took 40 of those wetlands. Sounds a lot. And everybody keeps on telling you, you've got to get those cows out that wetlands. There's terrible problems. You mustn't be burning wetlands. You should really not be doing anything. So after detailed work for many years, with an experiment, in the improved pastures and the semi-native pastures, with and without fire, with and without cows, a lot of work, 40 wetlands, surveying them every year. What we found, do not worry. All you need to remember is there are more species, not surprisingly, in these little wetlands in the less improved areas, in the semi-native areas. So the wetlands in those areas have higher species diversity. Regardless, there are always more species wherever you are in grazed wetlands than ungrazed wetlands. So grazing is an important disturbance. Grazing is about equivalent to fire. So you've got to have some level of disturbance to maintain wetland plant diversity. And the other thing is that wetlands that are in these areas, on average, each of these is multiple papers and hundreds of hours of work. Wetlands on average in the semi-native areas actually offer more ecosystem services than those that are in the in highly managed areas. So what happened as a result of that work? BMPs now allow grazing in wetland. This doesn't mean to say you put 1,000 cows in one wetland, but normal stocking density is okay. Grazing is now permitted under easements in Florida. It was not permitted before. This work made the difference in allowing big federal easements to allow grazing in private easements. We're increasingly working on how patchy fire benefits grazing. That's a new project. And grazing management, we have a new project looking at how we can use grazing, not to eliminate invasives, but actually as a tool to reduce invasives in these wetlands. So the question is, how do you take all that work, which is at the plot scale, all those little wetlands, how do we take that to the farm level? What does that mean at the farm or the ranch level? And then how do you take that and say, what does this mean to the ranch or continental-wide wetlands and grazing systems? Well, you can't do it all. So what we do is, for some reason, this map is terrible, but we're part, well, for my fault, it's terrible. We are part of a huge USDA network of 18 sites around the country. They're in the sort of darker, splodgy areas in these colored fruit bowl patterns. All you need to remember is Archbold won one of 18 slots in a national network of USDA research sites. So now we do our experiments, not just with us, but we're working with people over in Nunn, Colorado, people down in the Jornada, people up in Pennsylvania, researchers up in Pennsylvania. So we can scale up all of our research and ask those questions at a national and an international level about plant biodiversity and how ecosystems function, as well as lots of other things. So scaling up is really important to us, and joining global networks is really important to us. And when we think beyond that, there are many grassland and shrub systems around the world that have similar grasslands and shrubs to central Florida. So one of our long-term aspirations is that we form more conservation. We're not doing work out there, but can we form conservation networks and talk to individuals who are dealing with the same sorts of problems with us around the world and strengthen our knowledge by contributing to and drawing from them? Okay, we're on example number 2, everybody's favorite topic, phosphorus. So big process, phosphorus cycling, incredibly complicated. Land management solutions, what can we do about phosphorus? How do we engage in national networks? And what are some of our science into action? Those of you who come from Florida are probably painfully aware of these diagrams. So originally, giant sponge sheet flow from north of Lake Okeechobee. This is roughly where Archbold and Buck Island Ranch is, into the big Lake Okeechobee, and then historically slightly, flowed under high water conditions west, didn't flow east except through Miami River and places, and sheeted down into the Everglades. Nirvana. Modern plumbing nightmare. So first thing, the most important, we do not work in this land south of the Okeechobee. And there are, of course, wonderful scientists working there, but that's not what we're doing. This is a whole different thing. It's highly managed, highly plumbed, lots of federal lands, etc. But north of the lake, it is actually, amazingly, this is one of the few watersheds in Florida where the boundary now is still the same boundary that was 100 years ago, the edges. That doesn't mean to say what's happening in the middle of it. There's lots of canals and ditches, but we are at least dealing with the same boundary approximately. So if you take that same shape, the redder it is, the more problems we have with phosphorus. So, you know, that global map, too much phosphorus in those red places. One of those areas is, of course, Florida. And this is at a microcosm level. Where do we have too much phosphorus in our Florida soils? Florida soils are not, these are acid, sandy soils. They all came from up here at one point. So it's, you know, it's silica. It's your granite turned into our silica. And, you know, they're very complicated. Phosphorus, you know, it's a really complicated element to work on. Bottom line, there's a lot that's in the soil. And the first thing people told us is, it's those cows that are the problem. You have to get the cows out of these pastures and the phosphorus problem will magically disappear. Wrong. So we took pastures that had not been fertilized for 15 to 20 years from 1986 until the beginning of this project in 98. We had 16 pastures, you know, some with no cows, medium, low, high density cows. Didn't make one whit of difference how many cows, well, I'll rephrase that. It didn't make a significant difference how many cows were in those pastures. You still had way more phosphorus coming off the pastures that were those highly managed, highly modified, intensive grass pastures. 5 to 7 times, even 15 years after no phosphorus fertilizer, 5 to 7 times the amount of P. So the blue is in highly improved, modified pastures, and the purple, or whatever you want to call it, are the more native pastures. You can see in each year, low rainfall year, high rainfall year, doesn't matter. There's way more coming off the improved pastures. And all of this is a legacy, and we really know this worldwide. There's legacies of our land use from decades ago in the soil. There's no farmer or rancher that deliberately did this in the 1950s or 60s with the idea of creating a problem in 50 years' time. But the reality is we did create a problem, so we have to look for solutions. So that did mean that stocking rate, again, I'm not talking about 1,000 cows in a pasture, the stocking rate did actually say this wasn't the solution. Getting rid of the cows didn't make any difference. You're still having the same amount of phosphorus coming off these pastures. I don't expect you to understand, no, I do expect you to understand this. I don't expect you to see it. Bottom line is, this is the amount of pasture coming, this is the amount of phosphorus coming into a ranch. This took many years, by the way. This is what's happening in the ranch to phosphorus. So it's coming in hay, it might be coming in water. This is the cows, hay, everything. And this is what you're sending off the ranch. You might be sending it off in terms of little calves, or you might be sending it off in terms of sod you're harvesting, or you might be sending off hay. In 1995, the amount coming in, the net, was 5.6 kilograms per hectare. That's it's approximately 5 pounds per acre. So it was a net, in versus out. So we were constantly adding more and more phosphorus every year. By 2000, starting to dial back on fertilizer. We got a problem, Houston. Dial back on fertilizer. We didn't need all that P. We were down to 3 kilograms of phosphorus coming in versus, the net. And now we just finished this analysis, just published it this spring. We're down to 0.5 kilograms. We're nearly in balance. And that's been a huge reduction in fertilizer. Phosphorus, of course, is very available in Florida. It's the weirdest situation. We have a lot of phosphorus in our sediment, in our deposits. We have big marine deposits of phosphorus that can be mined. And we have right above soils that were naturally very low in phosphorus and wetlands that can't take phosphorus. They just go into algal blooms and everything else. So this odd thing that below ground we have the world's biggest supply of phosphorus, and above ground we have systems that can't take it. It's just who set that up. So here's the thing. The data shows we are really trying very hard and doing better. It's not just Archbold, all ranchers. This happens to be ours because we keep inordinately good records. And yet, we have been sampling around this is Archbold, map of Archbold. These are all our pastures, and this is the big Harney Pond Canal that shoots straight down to Okeechobee, taking everything in it that's coming off our ranch. And we've been sampling at the edge of the ranch, not in the canal, but sampling for years since 1991. Now, those samples aren't measuring the total amount of phosphorus. They're just a grab sample, every 3 months. So it just tells you what is happening that day. So it's not the total phosphorus. It doesn't take a huge amount of knowledge to understand that since 1991 until, I haven't added 2020, but I'm sorry to say it's no better, we are below the permitted level. That is good for us, on average, but we are not where we should be. We haven't moved the concentrations at all. There's still, if you take a sample, it's still got the same concentration. You think, what is this? Well, it's the legacy in the soil. And you're left thinking, what is the solution? We've tried so hard. Well, the solution is actually not managing cows, it's managing water. We've managed fertilizer, we have to manage water. This is the Buck Island Ranch, same map. We have 629 seasonal wetlands, that's a lot. We have more than 500 miles of ditches, that's a lot. And they're all connected. You can, maybe some of you in the back can't see it, but there are little white lines all over this. Those are all ditches collecting water and shooting it into the big Harney Pond Canal. The question is, we shifted our whole thinking. How do we slow the flow off this ranch? We can't, it seems very hard to budge concentration, but we can slow the flow off the ranch or hold water back, retain water. So we did early modeling. It said if you retain water in these improved pastures, we are not talking about flooding these. We're not talking about making them into swimming pools. We're talking about putting structures in ditches that'll hold water back so that it leaves the ranch more slowly, not hours to days, but days to weeks to months. And a lot of it goes back subsurface. So it's all about slowing the flow. And we calculated that if we did that, we could get up to a 19% reduction. That was our models in 2005. We have put in now more than 100 structures to control flow off Buck Island Ranch. Of course, because we're Archbold, we have thousands of sensors and tons of hours of modeling. So these are all big projects to slow the flow, different types. This project actually pumps water from this big canal, the Harney Pond Canal, flows it through and then sends it into this area. So we're actually taking local water and trying to reduce phosphorus in it by taking hay off this property. Anyway, bottom line, more than 100 structures. Do not worry about the graphs. What I am telling you is when we put those culverts in on the big study, we had a 22% reduction of flow, pretty close to what our modeling was. So we were able to reduce flow by 20%. That is actually a lot. That meant that our pastures were wetter for longer. The difference between a subdivision and a ranch is cows don't call their legislators saying their feet are wet. And that actually is a huge difference. Ranches can take being a little bit wetter for a little bit longer. They don't want to be flooded and they don't want cows up to the up there. But the second thing is our wetland areas, all those little wetlands, the wetland area, the amount inundated, increased 28%. That in turn was great. We did a huge project showing all the benefits for fish, for aquatic bugs, for frogs. Every wetland sort of associated species benefited from these things. And our evaporation increased in higher areas. All good. Good evidence of impacts. So these then got scaled up by state agencies into what are called payments for environmental services. Ranchers are now paid to hold water back. There's a set payment, they have a contract. There are numerous ones, you can see them all over. Archbold actually is a participant, we get a check, which we really like. And we also monitor, don't worry, we have someone checking ours, it's not us. We also monitor many of these other projects for the state agencies to show they're working. So there's been a whole series of projects, 5 different types of projects, all with different legislative support. This is not to say that reservoirs aren't important. It's not to say that big public works aren't important, but it is to say this is a possibility for private landowners and agencies to work together to try and reduce the flow. All of this took decades of work and many postdocs and PhDs, but we're so proud that it's got as far as it has. Okay, that's my last story. You dread to think where I am. Oh, not so bad, actually. My last story, predators, and I'm going to really focus a bit on black bears. So that's one of the predators I'm going to look at. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity. I'm going to talk about land use, and particularly if you're a bear, you have the right to roam or you have the need to roam. So what can we do to make sure that land use is enough, that large animals can... in Scotland, there is no law of trespass. You have the right to roam. You have to say it with a rolling R. And I really believe in the right to roam for Florida's biodiversity. A lot of education outreach I'm going to come into, how to engage statewide. I'm going to tell you a wonderful story about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So this is sort of science into conservation action. So Yes, there is a lot of animal biodiversity out on cattle ranches. Of course, everybody has those wonderful wildlife trap cameras now, and they put it their favorite hunting spot, which is often conveniently baited, and they get great photos. Well, of course, Archbold doesn't do that. We put a grid of 41 cameras across the ranch, and we take photographs in boring places as well as exciting places. But as a result of that, after 6 years, we get 1 million images a year from our cameras. Somewhat daunting, so now we have a big artificial intelligence team that work on screening through those and saying, that's a cow, that's a cow, that's a cow, that's a cow. Oh, that's a bobcat. So we get all that information. I just took a few examples. We get occasional panthers. This is the number, let me get this right. This is the number of observations on an annual basis over those cameras, on a monthly basis over those cameras. Average number of days per month, a camera saw a panther, an otter, a black bear, or, everyone loves them, but we do a lot of work on feral hogs because of disease transmission, and, they're really a huge challenge for us. If you want a Zahner lecture on hogs, go. We've had that lecture. Yeah, we did. It was interesting. Okay, good. Well, Raoul Boughton, Betsy's husband, has done a lot of this work. I would point out, there's some things that are quite interesting when you put them. You find out that actually otters are much more in those improved pastures than in the semi-native. Why? There's a lot more ditches, and of course they're very productive and full of food. That's what otters love. So, you get some interesting things when you do this systematically. So a lot of biodiversity on these working lands. And let's think about biodiversity on working lands. I always divide it into 3 big categories. There's things that they have habitats on working lands that support, species that are habitat specialists. These happen to be Florida grasshopper sparrows, one of the country's most endangered birds, down to very few individuals. And this Archbold has been working on grasshopper sparrows for about 15 years. Working very hard to, this is like emergency room 10 for grasshopper sparrows. We observe every nest. If it's a flooding condition, we lift them off the ground. We steam treat all the fire ant nests around them, with big steam pipes. We build fences to stop ground predators getting in. These are in emergency ward, whatever it's called here, 10 or something, full-scale press protection. I have a great news story to tell you. I'll just mention it quickly. One of the places where we've been working is a working ranch, and we had to keep it very secret for years. It was always called the ranch. Nobody was allowed to say where it was because we found, us and another team found these grasshopper sparrows not in these pristine, wonderful native grasslands, but in like semi-native or somewhat improved pastures out in the middle of this private ranch, and people are like, what? So we've been working there for 5 years. We've really got, they're doing very well on these ranches. We now realize they're doing well on other ranches. Nobody had just been out to see them. And I'm so happy to tell you this working ranch owned by the DeLuca family was recently donated in February this year, 27,000 acres, yes, to the University of Florida, with an easement held by Ducks Unlimited, and it's a really important ranch, so it's an extraordinary and exciting combination. We'll continue to work there with the university, continue on doing the biodiversity and bringing our Buck Island Ranch experience to them. So the other types of species are what I call habitat generalists, things like red-shouldered hawks, sandhill crane, species that do very well on working lands. I mean, extraordinarily well. There's a lot of food out there. And then the last one's the wide-ranging species, the large predators that need, hundreds of thousands or more of acres to have for areas, the right to roam. So when we think about protecting landscapes, we think about how to protect those rare habitats, how to make sure there's enough working lands for habitat generalists, and also how do we connect them to have the right to roam. So I'll just give you an example. I wake up every day. I work every day worrying about how to connect Archbold as part of a big regional landscape. It's really important for me. So this is Archbold Station here. This is Buck Island Ranch here. I don't have much time left. I'm going to retire at some point, but I want to be able to walk from Archbold Station to the ranch on conservation lands before I retire. It's one of my private, if anyone here would like to help me do that, please let me know. But When I first got to Archbold, we were 4,500 acres, half the size here. We're now part of a 53,000 acre contiguous conservation lands. These are all successive easements and state lands that went in. This is big, but this is a huge private conservation easement with USDA. This ranch, been working very hard with the family for the last 25 years. They have submitted for an easement. That was a huge step forward. If this ranch, which is an extraordinary ranch, one of the highest biodiversity jewels in the state of Florida, if this ranch goes into easement, Archbold immediately becomes part of a 150,000 acre connected landscape. Much of this is the Lakes land. Some of it is public lands, but the rest of it is private lands with easements, operating easements. So this idea, I sometimes have these wild dreams. In the middle of the night, I run landscape connectivity jigsaws in my head, and this ranch falls into place, which it could. And this part of Lakes falls into place and connects. And this little part falls in place and connects us up here. And suddenly we're talking about a 350,000 acre connected landscape, which would be quite extraordinary. It's a good thing to have dreams about. You need to scale that up to the regional level. So that's that big watershed, constantly thinking, working with private partners, looking at PES, the payments for environmental services, as well as easements, as well as acquisition. How do we connect this landscape? And that's what's going to help me drill down a little bit more on the black bear that we were talking about. So many years ago, a group of UF scientists and actually Archbold scientists as well had this vision of a connected Florida. This is from 1984. This was Larry Harris, Reed Noss, Dave Mayer, Tom Hochter, and several others had this vision. They imagined, but at that time, a low proportion of Florida was actually in conservation lands. In the meantime, also, a lot of work was done on the predators and how species move among this area. So at Archbold, we had Dave Mayer from University of Kentucky, now sadly no longer with us, and his graduate students worked on tracking bears in this area, really detailed work. We tracked nearly 60 individuals. And one of these individuals, M34, was just a star. M34, we don't tell everybody, but M34 sat under a feeder for about several months and didn't move a yard. And eventually we got the person giving all this food to stop, and M34 went on a wonderful, don't say that because it kind of ruins the story, but it's funny. M34 went on a wonderful walkabout for 10 weeks and ended up going from here through Avon Park all the way to the north end, got to the edge of I-4 and thought, not doing it. Got to the edge of I-4 again and thought, not doing it. Came all the way back, followed down the Kissimmee River, went over to Babcock Ranch, nearly over to the sort of Fort Myers area, and came back and dropped its collar very close to Archbold. So this bear, first of all, it inspired a lot of private landowners because they looked at that and thought, gosh, it's me and my neighbor and my neighbor and my neighbor that are contributing to this. And we can't just do this on conservation lands. We're not going to get there. We have to have these large intervening landscapes. So we were giving a conference on this, on our bear work, and there was a young photojournalist sitting in the back of the room, and he listened to all our talks, of course, deep science, lots of GIS, lots of math. And he gave some thought, and in the morning he said, I've really been inspired by this bear, and I want to think about something. How come this is Carlton Ward, so many of you, I know there are Ward family members that come to this area, so many of you may know them. Carlton, young photojournalist at that time, just really inspired. How come nobody, I didn't even know we had black bears here. How come nobody knows this? I'm a journalist, I should know, I'm a writer, I should know this sort of stuff. So Carlton envisaged a way of communicating. He had the tremendous ability of taking that science knowledge and making it meaningful for the public. And Carlton, along with Joe Guthrie, a graduate student who was working at Archbold, and Mallory Dimmitt, Vivi and Lawrence's daughter, Carlton pulled them in. It was his vision. They were going to walk the path of panthers and bears across Florida. And they took all those maps. The maps were now very refined. They spent days in our GIS lab mapping out the route, private and public lands. And their first expedition, they did this all on foot, on horseback, on paddleboard or kayak, and bicycle. So no mechanical power. And did 1,000 miles in 100 days from the Florida Bay all the way up to Okefenokee. It attracted huge amounts of attention. The public got inspired. All of us were enormously proud of them, and we fed them everywhere we could meet them. And some of us joined them for trips, which was sometimes more than we'd bargained for. The next one was from just south of Orlando all the way to the west coast, to the Alabama coast. And that was 1,000 miles in 70 days. They'd got more efficient. I think Mallory planned the route. I think it was like, we do not take 100 days. We're going to get there in 70. Then there were other shorter expeditions. So this generated this whole notion of the Florida Wildlife Corridor as something the public could buy into. It was a sort of inspirational storytelling. Carlton, of course, is an incredible inspirational storyteller, and he's done a deeper drill into the path of the panther. He's a National Geographic explorer now. This is the mini mag from the spring issue of the National Geographic this year, and this was his work with just, you have no idea how much patience is required to get a photograph like that. Just extraordinary. Often up to your neck in water for days on end would be the only description. Living in a pretty rough trailer, in my opinion, to get all of this. Anyway, have a look at this. The National Geographic got very excited. He's one of their, they just think he's a wonderful young explorer, and really drawing from the science but inspiring the public. So where did that leave? A year ago, a bit more than a year ago, we had a wonderful donor that put together the Florida Wildlife Corridor, the organization that spun up out of this, put together Carlton and his group, Florida Wild, pulled in Archbold and said, you guys, this is more than a story. You need to turn this into some legislative action. We're like, oh. And hence the big target from June 2020 through to this year was to pass in the Florida legislature an act in recognition of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. A tough row upstream, one would think, but no. So the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act looked for recognition of 17. Now, recognition is not designation, it's not zoning. It just says we need something of this semblance to go through Florida if we're going to be connected. This is also our green infrastructure for the future. These are our headwaters of our watersheds. This is servicing more than just panthers and bears. This could be what Florida needs at the heart of Florida to make sure Florida is a viable state going into the future. So look to the legislature for 17.6 million acres. Now, the extraordinary thing in Florida is there is already nearly 10 million acres that are actually in conservation. And we have to give a massive shout out to the enormous effort of 30 years of land acquisition in Florida. I mean, it was, 300 million a year under pre-2000, what's called Preservation 2000, another 300 million a year under Florida Forever. Florida bought more conservation land than the entire US every year from 1990 through to, just extraordinary achievement. It sponsored private matches. It got local people involved. It pulled in federal matches. Quite an extraordinary effort. This is not all federal land. There's a lot of state land and a lot of private land. And things like, military establishments and bombing ranges. There was also a request for 400 million. Well, it wasn't really a request. It was actually surprisingly a suggestion from the legislature of $400 million for easement and for continuation of the conservation programs. Hold your breath. It passed. It passed unanimously through the Florida legislature, House and Senate. They were so, what really caught them? This was something new and different. It wasn't a whole bunch of people saying, woe is me. This was inspiring storytelling. suddenly they got the bug. And it was so exciting. So it was passed on 6/29, that was the final. But as I was delayed on my arrival here on Monday because we had the governor. This is actually at the Nature Conservancy's Disney Wilderness Preserve, which is right in the middle of the corridor. The governor came, the parties, Florida Wildlife Corridor Coalition, Florida Wild, and Archbold were there in numbers. These are all our state legislatures, head of DEP, the new head of science at National Geographic, and then Carlton. Isn't it just typical Carlton taking a photo of the governor when people are taking a photo of Carlton? It was an extraordinary achievement. We had many of the leading ranchers in Florida there. This is Wilt Simpson, who was the president of the Senate, with many of our ranchers and other legislators for that event. So we are off a big high and an extraordinary week, but we have to we have so much work to do to make sure that this gets rolled out right and that we generate this excitement. People are, I would say, basically stunned. Stunned, happy, and amazed. I think, it's caused a huge flurry of press. So this is Kerry Sanders from the Today program, a big reporter, interviewing Jean Lullis, our ranch manager, and Buck Island Ranch as part of it. This was what came out in the next 2 days. And this is earned media. We didn't pay for any of this. And we had an article in the New Yorker by Dexter Filkins, which was really very impressive, and this has continued. So it's just largely been very positive press. And I have another sheet of ones that came out after the governor signed it this week, which was pretty pleased about the whole thing. It's been a lot of work for all of us to cope with this. I'm just going to skip this. So what I wanted to say is how much we have to learn from other areas that have the same challenges. So here you have this incredible network of conservation trust lands and national forests. At the heart of it, you have a research center. I realize we have the Ace Basin would be another one. Was it you, Tom, that you were telling me about your work in the Ace Basin? There are places around North America that are trying to do the same thing, package these. I would say we're right up there in Florida at the minute, having passed that. That was pretty extraordinary. But we want to contribute to and draw from those other places. What can we learn? How can we learn better how the Y-to-Y, that's the Yukon to Yellowstone corridor, is being connected? Along the Appalachian Trail, the purchase there. This is the big Jaguar Trail that goes through Central America down into South America. So, how do we start to work smarter as groups working in conservation to work with our other groups and to look for other locations? We don't want to work in all these places. We want to learn from them and share with them what we've learned. So sharing our knowledge, knowledge about wildlife corridors. So I'm not completely finished, but I will say that I've just gone through this and we've done the examples of plants, plants, phosphorus, and predators. I'll just end by a few notes. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you about carbon, but it would have been such fun, and it would have been so inspiring for all of you, because I got some real secrets in that story that you might not have imagined. So we have an amazing educator, Dustin Angel. He would be your equivalent here, who does tremendous reach out into the K through 12 programs. Also, we do lots of informal education and reach a lot of people. So we're very blessed to have a very active learning center and outreach and education. We really regard sharing the science that we are doing with everyone from K to Gray, as they say, as a very important part of our mission. And Dustin is just quite extraordinary. We've had more than 600 research internships at Archbold since 1990. Most of them stay 6 to 12 months with us. Many of them are now leading professors coming back and doing research at Archbold, which is pretty extraordinary. So We offer about 20 to 30 a year. They work in the programs, they work with the researchers helping to collect data and being mentored. And then they also do their own independent research project, and they're required to do that. And then they're usually in that gap year between undergraduate and graduate. So post-baccalaureate internships, very successful. And they are really responsible. The ones on the ranch, they've collected a lot of the data that I showed you. We're so grateful to them. We really try to work hard. I know some of you get our newsletter. That's just we work hard at a monthly newsletter with different stories. So if you'd like to receive it, I've left my cards there. So just send me an email and we'll make sure that you get the newsletters if you're interested. We have different stories about our research, conservation, education, and also highlight some of how you can help Archbold sort of funding requests. We do a weekly newspaper article, nearly kills us, I don't know why, but that has really built a community around us. Every week we do another article about Archbold in the newspaper. It's like, I won't even talk about the ethics of his Jeff, because you'll probably think it's unacceptable. We have active social outreach programs. And last year, just like you with COVID, we found ourselves, our research all continued. That didn't change, but we couldn't welcome the public or school children. So I actually got a grant from NSF to set up a new thing called the Virtual Field. And they funded us and other field stations. There was a group of us, 50 field stations, teamed together. And we really worked hard on virtual outreach. And we worked hard on how can people learn even when they weren't there. It was like we kind of all, of course, I don't want to diminish the impacts of COVID. It's just been terrible, but it ended up forcing us into doing something that we probably should have done 5-10 years ago, go virtual and amplify our message. And this is particularly important for diversity. We are now going to be able to reach more communities, underrepresented communities, communities in urban areas, underserved communities. Our community is very underserved. We have a very high ratio of free school meals. The average, there's only 15% of the people in our county have a degree beyond high school. We are in a seriously underserved community. But going virtual, we've really built up our YouTube channel. We're part of this field station network. We see that as a way to amplify our education. We're talking to the Florida Department of Education about how can we serve this information into all Florida schools, not just what we're doing at Archbold. So it's been it was a challenging year for all of us, you as well as us, as well as all the communities we live in. But it has really opened our eyes to new possibilities that we hadn't considered. So I'm going to end on that note. I really want to say again, thank you for having me here. It's been really lovely watching your faces and I'm talking. It's so nice we're not in a dark auditorium. So I really love that and how much I've appreciated it. And I also want to give a big shout out. Archbold, yes, we're independent and non-profit, but we are so dependent on the support of wonderful donors, the support of many federal, state agencies that pay for our work, and our collaborators, many scientists, and increasingly the conservation community. I'm very happy to say in 2 weeks' time, we're going to hire our first director of conservation, really excited about that, someone who'll work full-time on conservation outreach. So I just want to thank everybody who helps us. And it's, for me, been a quarter-century privilege to work at Archbold, and it was such a privilege to come here and share that with you tonight. So thank you.
Tied in. Can you help me better understand the difference between the improved pastures versus the semi-native? Is it improved because of the
So they're improved because, one, the original vegetation is cleared and was replaced by planted agronomically favorable grasses, typically, but not exclusively, Bahia grass, which is a South American paspalum notatum. Fertilized. So they had, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizer from after World War II all the way up through to the 80s, mid-80s, at which point they said dial back on the P, but they still receive nitrogen fertilizer. That's another story, actually a sort of more interesting story in some ways. And then they were more heavily ditched, so they had more drainage coming off them because they're generally slightly higher elevation.
Okay, so So they were choice land for
Yes.
grazing initially, and that's why they invested.
Well, they were
in the-
maybe more choice land because they were possible to manage. They weren't necessarily, they had a habitat called dry prairie, which was pretty well, which was really reduced throughout Florida. The lower elevation, you know, a little elevation goes a long way in Florida. We're talking about 3 feet, no, feet, not inches, 3 feet lower. That is actually much harder to drain, had slightly more organic soils. But the advantage of those areas is they actually provide good winter forage. So a lot of ranchers quite like having the Bahia pasture. Bahia doesn't grow in the winter because it's photoperiod limited. It needs a certain day length to grow vigorously. So they often kept those more, I call them semi-native because they're not true native pastures. You know, couldn't resist throwing out some Bahia, you know, things. So they're sort of halfway house. They're not really rangeland, not classic rangeland, but they never were fertilized. They were never fertilized, they were less drained, and they have fewer but no non-native species in them.
Well, thank you. If you have questions, you can probably find Hilary's going to be here at the reception. There's a bar, there is food, there is materials over here about both of our organizations. This has been a thrill. Thank you. Hi, I'm Charlotte Muir, the Executive Director of the Highlands Biological Foundation. Thank you so much for watching our video. For more information, please click below in the YouTube show notes that will have links to anything you need regarding HBF or the lecture we just shared. Thanks.